Hi, everyone. Welcome to the CAPE Lecture Series. We very much look forward to in-person options in the fall, and those details are still being worked out. For now, however, I turn today's lecture over to Christina Stark, today's host, and she's also the lecture series chair. So if you have ideas, send them her way. The chat feature will be closed. We encourage everyone to use the raised hand icon. You'll find that under the raised hand, or if your window is small, under the three dots that say more. Take it away, Christina.
Thank you, Cindy. And it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Tom Gilovich. Dr. Gilovich is the Irene Blecker Rosenfeld Professor of Psychology at Cornell University and co-director of the Cornell Center for Behavioral Economics and Decision Research. He received his BA in psychology from the University of California at Santa Barbara and his PhD from Stanford University. Dr. Gilovich specializes in the study of everyday judgment and reasoning, and this research interest has led him to study how gamblers selectively remember their past performance, how decision makers are influenced by irrelevant analogies, how people come to have the types of regrets that they do, why people are reluctant to tempt fate, how people's egocentrism makes it hard for them to accurately assess how they are seen by others, and why people can find it so easy to be resentful and so hard to be grateful. In addition to his articles in scientific journals, Dr. Gilovich has written several books, alone and with others, including How We Know What Isn't So, Why Smart People Make Big Money, Social Psychology, and The Wisest One in the Room. He has also co-edited Heuristics and Biases, The Psychology of Intuitive Judgment. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a fellow of several other associations, including the American Psychological Association. As Cindy just said, if you have questions, and Tom reminds me, this is a conversation, so if you have questions along the way, he'd like to keep it as a conversation, feel free to raise your symbolic Zoom hand. And also just to note, we are recording today's presentation if you want to watch it again or let others who couldn't come today know about it. So Tom, the screen is yours.
Okay. One of the reasons that many of us went into higher education is the in-personal interaction with the audience. And we've learned over the last 2 years how to deal with not having that, having Zoom meetings where you see people in these little boxes. And today I'm going to have to take it one step farther because this is a Zoom webinar, so I can't see any people that I'm speaking to. So I will do my best and hope you're out there and attentive. I wish we could interact more. Anyway, I want to talk about conversation today, and my work on conversation started with this statement that people often make, particularly psychologists often make, that humans are a social species, and there's many reasons why psychologists say that, including the fact that if you're socially disconnected, you feel lonely. That's as big a risk for mortality as being obese or smoking cigarettes. Social connection is just vitally important. And talking to other people is the most frequent social thing that we do. And so it's important to understand conversation. It's a broad topic, obviously, because there's so many different types of conversations. I want to talk about conversations not with your family members or your very best friends, but, you know, people in your family, people you know well, also perfect strangers, people who are in your orbit that you see at cocktail parties, dinner parties, etc. What is that like? And like many things in life, a lot of people approach those conversations with some mixture of hope and fear. People hope that their conversations will be like this, that everybody's having a good time and the people you're speaking to are paying rapt attention to you. Those are our hopes, but a lot of people fear that they'll be boring the people they're talking to, or perhaps even worse, the people they're talking to will be tedious and will be boring them. Now, of course, each person has a slightly different mix of hope and fear. And I became interested in the question of how does the average person approach this? With what mixture of hope and fear? And some hint, just from talking to people, occasional hints would arise that maybe there's a lot more fear than we might recognize. This is captured, I think, in this wonderful quote from a staff writer from the New Yorker, Nathan Heller, that we spend half of our lives struggling to start conversations and the other half struggling to exit them. And people often talk about one of the reasons they find conversations so difficult is they just can't figure out how to end them. And party hosts and human resource personnel, they often do things to create icebreakers to get people talking, and that's a good thing. But this quote suggests maybe we ought to focus also on some ice makers, how to get people to figure out how to exit from the conversation. So anyway, are people in general like Nathan Heller? Is there that much fear of conversation out there? Well, one of the first things we did in studying conversation was to try to find out how good do people think they are at it? And how good do they think they are at it compared to a bunch of other things that life requires us to do? Is this at the bottom? You think that you aren't as good a conversationalist as you are a host of other things? Or is it at the top, somewhere in the middle? To answer that question, you need some kind of random sampling of things that people do. And to pick that, to find such a random sample, we borrowed from a study that Matt Killingsworth and Dan Gilbert did, where this was an experience sampling study where people carried around their smartphones. They downloaded an app that Killingsworth created, and it randomly beeped them during the day, and you filled out two simple questions. What are you doing right now? And how happy you are. And you see in the chart there, that's all the things that people were captured doing. The bigger the circle, that means they said they were doing that more often. The smaller, that's something people did less often. And we're not going to focus on this part, but they're also scored from the far left activities that they say they aren't having that much fun while they're doing them, to things on the far right, which are the things that make people most happy when they're doing them. So I'm just showing you this as people are randomly beeped. So this is a random set of activities. It's so we aren't cherry picking any results here. And what we did, rather than ask them how happy they were, we just asked people, how good are you at these different things? And included in there is engaging in conversation, informal conversation. Please rank them in terms of your abilities. And a remarkable thing happens. Of all the things in that list, this representative sample of things that we do in our lives, initiating and sustaining conversation in these informal environments like a cocktail party, dinner party, it's the thing that people think they're worst at. Now, you could say, well, that's just, they still think they're pretty good. They're just worse than these other things, but they still think they're pretty good at it. To see whether people are actually troubled by their abilities at conversation, we just took the same activities, and rather than having them rank them, had people essentially rate themselves. How do you compare to people like you, someone your age and sex, in terms of all these activities? How good of a sleeper are you? How good are you at performing your job? How good are you at conversation? Do people think they're above average conversationalists, below average conversationalists? And as you can see, in all the things that life calls upon us to do, we think we're above average. This is the famous above average effect. People think they're above average leaders, above average drivers. The most the signature finding here, it turns out that if you interview people who are in the hospital as a result of motor vehicle accidents, they will say on average that they're better than average drivers. And some of them are, they're hospitalized because it was someone else's fault. But it can't be the case that the sample of people in the hospital for motor vehicle accidents are better than average drivers, but people think they are. And what's noteworthy here is that that's true of every activity except conversation, where people think they're a little bit below average. Was this something quirky about the activities that Killingsworth and Gilbert discovered in their experience sampling study? Suppose we did a different set. How robust is this result? So we did the same thing with activities from a psychological inventory known as the Daily Activities Questionnaire. And as you can see here as well, people think they're better than average on a host of things, not conversation. There's only one thing that people think they're worse at than conversation, and that's trying a new sport. You might object as well, like, how meaningful is this, in the sense that, is this really all about conversation, or is this conversation reflects social anxiety, and people are going to feel social anxiety for any social event? So anything that's social, people are going to think that they're below average at. And a lot of these activities aren't all that social. Finding your way, going shopping needn't be social, etc. Doing your chores often isn't social. What is conversation different than other social activities? Let's do the same thing with another scale, the Leibowitz social anxiety scale, where everything is a social activity. And again, you see that conversation, this thing that we do all the time, we don't think we're especially good at. And it troubles people. If you ask people when they're about to perform these different activities, how much do you feel anxious, apprehensive versus happy, relaxed, etc.? What you find is, for the positive activities, the positive emotions, people aren't feeling that so much when it comes to conversation on average. Of course, a lot of people do enjoy informal conversation. When it comes to an index of the negative emotions there, those activities, talking to other people, engaging in informal conversation, are the two activities that produce the most negative emotions. If you restrict it to the anxiety-related negative emotions, again, those two are right at the top, very different from all of the rest. So, on average, people don't think they're the greatest conversationalists. And that's surprising in a way, because we're pretty good at thinking we're pretty good at things. The above average effect exists for so many other activities. For so many other activities, we're like the people on the left here, feeling pretty good about ourselves. When it comes to conversation, we're more like the people on the right. And that raises, I'm a psychologist, it raises, I think, an interesting psychological question. Why not? What is it about conversation that's different than these other things that make people feel pretty confident in their abilities? Well, one way to answer that question is to say, what are the things that make people think that they're so good at so many other things? There are a variety of determinants of this above average effect. But one is a very reliable phenomenon known as the self-enhancing attributional bias. We tend to explain events that happen to us. We take credit for our successes, whereas we blame failures on bad strategies, bad luck, bad weather. And so we attribute negative things to things outside of us. So we take credit for the success, and that means we can feel pretty good about ourselves. We don't take credit for the negative stuff, so we don't have to feel bad about ourselves. Is there reason to think that we don't do that when it comes to conversation? Well, to find out, Before the pandemic, we had people come to our lab and engage, people who didn't know each other, engage in sometimes a 10-minute conversation, sometimes a 15-minute conversation. Afterwards, we separated them and interviewed them separately, and they were asked to think back on their conversation. What were the 3 best things that happened? What were the 3 worst moments during the conversation? And then they made these attribution ratings. To what degree were the worst moments due to you versus your conversation partner? Same thing for the best moments. And what you find for the best moments, people are pretty even-handed. It's partly me, it's partly the other person. When it comes to the worst moments, on the other hand, they attribute them disproportionately to themselves, which is different than so many other areas of life, as psychological research has shown. So there's something different here. Now, what are these worst moments that people are worried about and attribute to themselves? If you ask people to the extent that you ever worry about engaging in informal conversation, going to a dinner party, etc., what are you worried about? The dominant response, over 50% of the responses, are not knowing what to say. People are worried about awkward silences. Okay, to study that a little more, we created a laboratory cocktail party. We brought people to the lab, a lot of them. The average group size was 8, but there were as many as 15 people at the cocktail party in our lab. Our laboratory cocktail venue doesn't look quite like the picture there, but it was a vast space, and people were told that they could talk about anything they wanted to with whomever. Just like in a cocktail party, you can start out talking to these 3 people, decide, okay, time to move on, and move to another little conversational group. When they were done, they were again interviewed separately, and they were asked to think about the most significant moments during the conversations when you felt like maybe you were struggling to know what to say. And then we asked them about those. And most of the time, people were able to say, yeah, there were those moments. Not everyone, but most people did say there were moments like that. And they were asked, how do you think the other people you were talking to, or the other person, how do you think they would evaluate you as a result of your struggling to come up with something to say? Since it's unlikely that anyone would think that they would judge them more positively, the scale is bounded at 0, it has no effect, to -9, they're going to think less of me. And how awkward did you make the situation when you couldn't think of something to say? They were also asked to think about moments when it appeared that someone they were talking to was struggling to know what to say, and to rate that on the same scales. How much did it change your evaluation of that person, and how awkward did it make the situation? And people thought their own periods of silence when they were struggling to know what to say would have a bigger impact on the impression made than the other person's difficulty in coming up with something to say, and that it was more awkward when they couldn't do it than when someone else couldn't do it. Now, is this because, as indicated earlier, that people are blaming themselves more for these periods of awkward silence? After all, when there's a period of awkward silence, no one's talking. Do people nonetheless, even though they are jointly responsible for it, do people disproportionately blame themselves, again, in a way that's at variance with the normal human tendency to take credit for successes and blame failures externally? And to do this, we conducted another study. People were brought into the lab to have a conversation. The true subjects, Cornell students, they had a conversation with our confederate, who was trained to just engage in pleasant conversation with every subject, to go where the subject wanted to go in the conversation, and to keep it lively until at the 3:45 mark, the confederate just goes silent, introduces a moment of silence. And not just a short moment, a moment long enough to make it just painfully awkward. And then we had people rate who was responsible for the silence. Now, objectively, the Confederate is responsible for it. The Confederate was coached to do this, and the subjects saw that when they're asked who's responsible for the silence. It's toward the Confederate end of the scale, but not very far. It's kind of remarkable. People seem, even though the Confederate completely controlled this awkward event, they're making ratings near the middle of the scale. Now, how do we interpret that? Well, one way to interpret it is these conversations were recorded. We played them for other people and had them rate who was responsible. They've seen that the Confederate just goes silent. What are their ratings? And they attribute it more to the Confederate than the person themselves. Being in the conversation and experiencing that level of awkwardness somehow makes you sort of blame yourself. Silence, as it says there, is not at all golden. It produces a level of anxiety and a level of self-blame that feeds this idea that we're not very good at conversation. People don't think, unlike so many other areas of life, they're particularly good at conversation. Part of the reason for that is they don't make self-serving attributions for the ups and downs of their conversation. That also raises this why not question. Why do we engage in self-serving thinking everywhere else in life, but not here? And the key to understanding that comes from David Hume, who said it may be affirmed in general that all the merit a man may derive from his conversation arises from nothing but the pleasure it conveys to those who are present. In other words, when we do most things in life, there's often some structure that allows us to evaluate ourselves. How good a job are we doing? There's other metrics that allow you to feel like, okay, this wasn't so bad, or even this was great. When it comes to conversation, the other person's opinion is completely sovereign. If you loved a conversation and then you found out that the other person didn't like it, you no longer love that conversation. The whole point of conversation, or a large part of the conversation, is to make sure the person you're talking to finds it rewarding. Either they have a good time or they learn things, whatever. But if you haven't moved the dial in a positive direction in the other person's head, you feel like a failure in a way that's not true in so many other areas of life. We can draw an analogy here between those sports where it doesn't really matter how you did. What matters is what judges thought that you did. There, it's the judges' opinions that are sovereign. And that's different than other sporting events where it's how high, how far, how fast you run, jump, etc. Where the metric of whether you're doing well or not is how it stacks up to an objective criterion. And if you ask people, as we've done, people who played both types of sports, when you remember getting ready to perform, in which of these sports were you most nervous? And overwhelmingly, people said they were more nervous when the determination of whether they were successful or not was about what the judges thought, not what the tape measure said. Conversation is very similar that way because, again, it's what the other person thinks that matters. And to test this, we did a survey where you ask people, you have them think about a cocktail party conversation. Imagine that you and another person are introduced at a party. You proceed to have a get-to-know-you conversation with this person. And afterwards, you're asked to rate how much you enjoyed it. Imagine further that you enjoyed the conversation. You rated it a 9, and your partner rated it a 5, or the opposite. You rated it a 5, your partner rated it as a 9. The prediction here is, even though you enjoyed it, you rated it a 9. Once you realize your partner rated a 5, it's no longer a 9 for you. That's going to have a big effect. And that's different than other activities. And here we want to keep the activity as close to the same as possible in the two conditions. But now it's not not the unstructured cocktail party kind of conversation, but a very structured one, where the point of the conversation is to convince the other person of the importance of a large-scale problem facing the world today. Now, notice here, the other person's judgment matters. You feel better if you've convinced that person, but you can feel good about what you did, even if the other person is just narrow-minded and doesn't see the light that you have seen. And they're asked again to imagine further that you thought you did great. You rated a 9, the other person rates it a 5. What happens in these two environments? The prediction is there's something special about conversation because the other person's judgment is sovereign, whereas that's not true for this more persuasive conversational context. And again, so at the end, they're asked, all right, given all of this, how would you say the conversation went if someone were to ask you about it? And what you see is when the other person thinks it's a 9, it's great. You're convinced it's a 9. When it comes to a structured conversation that you rated a 9, and the other person thought it was a 5, well, they thought it was a 5. That's their problem. They didn't recognize all the great arguments that I made. But when you thought it was a 9 and the other person thought it was a 5, and it's a cocktail party we're talking about, again, the other person's judgment matters, not yours, and therefore you feel like, oh, you come away. I didn't succeed at my task. If the other person didn't like it, I did not succeed. Okay, so what are we left with here? On average, people think they aren't very good at conversation. Part of the reason for that is that people don't give themselves credit for the good points of conversation and blame the bad points on other people the way they do for so many other areas of life. So conversation is kind of different, which raises the question of if so many people think they're below average on this, or at least unlike all the above average areas of life that they are in contact with. It raises the question of, well, some people are good conversationalists, and can we be better conversationalists ourselves if we sort of copy these people? So in other words, what we found out in these early studies just raised the question of what makes a good conversationalist? And I'd like to be like that person. How can we copy them? So to try to study what these good conversationalists do, we used an experimental technique where we asked subjects at Cornell, students at Cornell, who's the best conversationalist you know? They would tell us, and then I personally would interrogate them and say, wait a minute, is this person, I need to be assured that this person is a really good conversationalist, not someone who's just charismatic or someone you like being around. It's someone you like being around because they're very good at conversation. Is that right? Most of the time people would say, yeah, that's what I meant. But every now and then they'd say, you're right. It's just a charismatic person or someone I'm drawn to. But they really aren't. Maybe they wouldn't be a good conversationalist just anywhere. Okay, name one of those people. And finally, we had a list where some people, they were sure these were good conversationalists. We also asked them to nominate someone who's not a good conversation, not someone who's terrible, just someone who's similar to that person, but is like the rest of us when it comes to conversation. We then go after those people, and we invite them to come in and participate in our studies. From the early research that I've told you about already to the start of this study, a pandemic happened, so these are no longer conversations in our lab. Happily, this in normal times would have meant, normal pandemic times, if there is such a thing, would have meant, okay, we're not studying conversation anymore. Happily, as we've all been grateful for, just as the pandemic hit, Zoom appeared, and we could have these conversations over Zoom. People who didn't know each other would converse. And sometimes there was one of the nominated good conversationalists in that group talking to another good conversationalist, sometimes talking to an average conversationalist. And we recorded them and scored them on a variety of things, just taking a purely empirical, non-theory driven approach to finding out who are the good conversationalists. So they're recorded and they're scored. Some of the scoring is objective. We just count the number of times people are going like this. Sometimes it's subjective. We have our research assistants look at them and say, how warm is the woman on the left there? How warm is the guy on the right there throughout the 10, 15-minute conversation? And what do we find? Well, good conversationalists did not differ from average conversationalists in terms of the number of questions they asked, in terms of how often they did these certain affirmations like nodding their head or going, They weren't different in terms of the number of new topics they introduced or the number of times they'd say things that seem like good things to say in a conversation. Tell me more. Oh, me too. Totally. Those kinds of affirmations, you would think a good conversationalist would do more of those, but surprisingly not. They did differ from the average conversationalist in terms of a particular type of affirmation, which is sort of the first rule of improvisational comedy. You affirm and then say and. Yes, and bring something new to the table. They also differed and they just talk faster than the rest of us. Often a bit louder. Obviously, there's going to be a curvilinear pattern to that. If someone's a super loud talker, we find that annoying. But on average, the good conversationalists talked faster and louder. The raters thought that they were able to just make the other person comfortable. And part of that was the warmth that they projected. So what do we make of all of this? Putting together the ways in which good conversationalists don't differ from the rest of us and the ways they do, that gives rise to some theories or hypotheses about what makes a good conversationalist. So what do those results tell us about any underlying principles of what makes a good conversationalist? Well, going back to the speed of speech, the volume of speech, someone who brings lots of enthusiasm to the table is going to do that. So that was hypothesis number one. And that's derived from this initial study. What about the fact that so many people doubt their own conversational ability? What does that tell us about any underlying principles? That gives rise to a second hypothesis, which we called the Maya Angelou hypothesis. Maya Angelou, in addition to being the poet laureate of the United States at one time, is famous for the quote that people won't remember what you did, they won't remember what you said, but they will remember how they felt around you. And if people bring lots of doubt to their conversation, lots of insecurities, if you take those away, take those insecurities away, you reassure people, you're going to be considered a good conversationalist. So the hypothesis is that the good conversationalists just calm the people they're talking to down. They're reassuring, and they can do that in a variety of different ways.
I'm going to interrupt this conversation just because someone did ask a question that's appropriate right now. They were very curious how you recruited the good conversationalists. Did they know that's why they were being asked?
Generally, no. That is, we did not want to tell them. We just said, we're running a study, and a friend of yours thought you'd be interested and you'd be a good participant in the study. And it was clear from interviews that some people didn't know that they were selected because they were thought to be good conversationalists. But of course, we can't control what the friend who nominated them and this person, what they say to one another. And there were some people who did know that, okay, I'm being asked to talk to another person because someone thinks I'm a great conversationalist. So we would have preferred if no one knew that. And we lucked out and we succeeded at that in some circumstances, but not in all.
Okay, thanks. That's great.
Okay. Any other bases for other hypotheses? Well, what should we conclude from the fact that the most common answer that people give when they're asked what makes a good conversationalist is somebody who's easy to talk to? And what does that mean? Well, this gives rise to, I'll apologize in advance for the obscure reference, the David Ferrer hypothesis. David Ferrer is probably the best professional tennis player that probably none of you listening to me know who he is. He's a Spanish player who was lightning quick and could get to every ball and incredibly consistent, hit it back all of the time. He just wasn't powerful enough to beat the big guns, the Rafa Nadals and Roger Federers and Novak Djokovic's. He won a lot of significant tournaments, none of the big four tournaments. But tennis players know him as tireless and like a human backstop. And good conversationalists are like David Ferrer. That is, you throw something out, you can be sure that it's coming back. It's fun to play tennis with people who can get the ball back to you. It's not so fun if you hit it over there, it doesn't come back, and you're just walking around all the time. And what's true of tennis, the hypothesis is true of conversation. It's more fun to talk to people who, when you hit something in their direction, they're able to hit it back to you. So we start out with a very purely empirical approach and immersing ourselves in the conversation world for a while gives rise to this more conceptual approach where we go in with these three hypotheses, and now we want to test them. Happily, the pandemic is not entirely over, but Cornell opens up a bit. So we go to the Big Red Barn, and we have a talkathon, basically. People are engaged in shorter conversations, round-robin conversations. It's like speed dating, where you move around from desk to desk. You talk for 5 minutes to a different person. And then afterwards, you fill out a very brief questionnaire. Because there are lots of conversations you have to do, the questionnaire can't be very long. And so we focus on 2 questions designed to test each of these 3 hypotheses. So when it comes to testing the Maya Angelou hypothesis, or the good conversationalists, people who reassure their conversation partners, you get very clear evidence of that. The good conversationalists, as we saw in the first study, the purely empirical one, they're warmer than the average person. And they're judged to have this ability. Whatever they say, however they present themselves, they are seen as making the other person feel more comfortable. So we get confirmation of the Maya Angelou hypothesis. What about the no substitute for enthusiasm hypothesis? Each subject is asked about the person they're talking to. How into the conversation did the other person seem? How energetic was the other person? And when that other person was judged by a friend to be a good conversationalist, you thought they were more into the conversation and they were more energetic. So there is no substitute for enthusiasm in lots of places of life, very much including engaging in conversation. And what about the David Ferrer hypothesis? the subjects themselves, when they were talking to a good conversationalist, they thought, oh, I can trust my partner to keep the conversational ball rolling. And my partner always seemed to have a good follow-up with anything that I said, a follow-up that advanced the conversation. Notice the difference between, these are statistically significant differences. The effect is weaker for the David-Ferrer hypothesis, to compare the yellow and green bars here, with what they're like for the other two hypotheses. But we get significant support for all three. So what can we conclude from that? How might we change how we approach conversations ourselves, especially any conversation that, you go into a lot of conversations, you're completely comfortable. Imagine going into one where you're less certain this is going to be good. What can you learn from these empirical results that might be helpful? How can I be a better conversationalist? Well, with respect to there being no substitute for enthusiasm, be mindful of that fact and give the person you're talking to the energy and attention he or she deserves. If you're going to be in a conversation, be in the conversation and psych yourself up. It's usually not that hard to be enthusiastic. If you're going to be with someone, truly be there. With respect to people, will mainly remember how you made them feel. If you're feeling underconfident about how good of a conversationalist you are, chances are that the person you're talking to as well. So make it easier for them, and it will be easier for you. A little warmth and, top point there, a little enthusiasm goes a very long way.
So Tom, a question again.
Yep.
Right here is,
Yep.
What happens to the social cues with masks covering, particularly our, ability to smile? People can see our eyes and our head nodding, but you lose something with the mask.
You do, but it is remarkable. Happily, the smile muscle, the zygomaticus major muscle that causes the crinkles in the eye, happily the mask doesn't cover that up. So you, even with a mask on, you can detect whether someone is happy, if someone is smiling at least. So yeah, things are, it's a more challenging conversational environment with a mask on. It's particularly challenging, should I enter the conversation? Often, do I know this person? You're at Wegmans and you're trying to find out, oh, is that so-and-so? Often you are underconfident that you've identified the person, so you don't have these conversations as much as you would. I suspect that masks have a bigger effect on do I enter or not than how the conversation goes. But the questioner is exactly right. It's some of the signals that allow us to be better at it are degraded, and it makes it harder. But interestingly, what we've found, I'm going to give an impression. We haven't nailed this with all of the analyses we need to do in order to be able to say that what I'm about to say is absolutely true. But the suggestion from the data that we have is good, not surprisingly, good conversationalists differ from average conversationalists even more in especially challenging conversational environments. For example, I talked about studies where we bring two people together and they talk to each other in a dyadic interaction. We also had three-person conversations, triadic interactions. And it looks like the good conversationalists stand out from the rest of us even more in that three-person environment, which is arguably much more challenging because it's more dynamic and there's not turn taking. It's just harder to figure out what to do there. So what that means is you could imagine a mass sort of homogenizing things and making the average conversationalist not that much different from the good conversationalist. We haven't looked at that explicitly, but what we've looked at in terms of challenging and non-challenging conversations suggests that No, actually, the good conversationalists would excel even more in those contexts.
I'll let you continue. That I do have a couple more questions. So you tell me if you want them now or to finish your thought on this slide.
I would normally say let's handle them now, but since I'm right at the end, let me do that, and then we'll take them. Third point, getting the conversational ball over the net makes for a good conversation. So what to do about that? Well, often people feel like, if I'm going to be a good conversationalist, I really have to be spontaneous, etc. And yes, good spontaneous things are good. Bad spontaneous things are not. But notice there's nothing wrong with having a list of talking points. If you're anxious about a conversation, think in advance about what there is to talk about, what another person is interested in, and have those at the ready. I have a colleague at Harvard, Allison Wood Brooks, who's doing work on this, and the early results suggest that, yeah, prepping a little beforehand, which we do in talks like this. I'm winging a number of things, but I'm not completely winging it. That preparation makes for a better talk. There's no reason we can't do that in informal conversation as well. Okay, so in no research talk is ever the final word about anything. But I'm going to say that's especially true about conversation, especially true about the state of the art of conversation research at this point. But that's not a bad thing, because even if we were further along, there would never be a final word about conversation. Given that we're such social creatures, there'll always be more to say about the subject of conversation. There is a final word, not about the general subject of conversation, but a final word about this talk, and it's a word of gratitude. Just want to express my thanks to these people who did a lot of the work here, and to these groups, including 2 former Cornell undergraduates who have funded the research. So thank all of them, and thank you for your time and attention. And I'd be happy to answer those questions that you mentioned.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm sorry it was more of a one-way conversation in terms of the format, but I think we got, a lot of really good ideas and information. There are 2 questions that are basically the same, related to what gender differences have you found, or, do your findings hold irrespective of gender? So,
yes, we have, for the things that I talked about today, we haven't found gender differences. And for some of the studies, we have large enough samples of men and women that we can really say that that's a real null result and no difference between men and women. For other ones, we just don't have the sample size. Once you break it down separately, we just don't have the statistical power to really know what's going on.
Another question someone's asking is, do most people want to be good conversationalists? Do some people want to control others in conversation? If you're able to
that's an interesting idea. We can say with great assurance that most people want to be good conversationalists. Notice that gets back to the idea that one of the reasons conversation arouses so much anxiety is that the other person's judgment is considered decisive. And for most people, that's true. But I hadn't thought of this before. It's an interesting question, but there probably are some people who just don't care. Oh, you didn't like it? I did. That's fine. And or the goal isn't to make it mutually rewarding. It's to, who knows what. If you have a different agenda, then things may very well be different. So we've taken it as a given that people generally want it to be enjoyable, mutually enjoyable, but yeah, it may very well be the case that some people don't care.
Okay, and I have someone who's raised their hand, and I'm going to allow that person to talk.
Excellent. Okay.
Chris,
Well, now I have an audience. I can see a name at least, not a face. Excellent. Okay, Chris, take it away.
Actually, I'm Elaine Angst, and I was wondering, your research subjects were all college students, yes? Are there cultural differences that you might see if you actually looked at different communities?
I'm trying to think. We've done some studies where, especially all of our talking studies where people are brought into the lab or they're in their house over Zoom. Those have all been college students, although some of the Zoom people were recent college graduates who were recontacted. Some surveys we've done involve quasi-random samples of the population. So some of the work isn't solely restricted to college students. We're not the only ones doing conversation research, and so some people have done research in other cultures. And one area of concern when it comes to cross-cultural psychology that's been high on people's research agenda for the last 25 years is the big difference between East Asia and Europe and the United States on interdependence and independence, and interdependence and the importance of that. Well, one way that we create and maintain these interconnections is through conversation. So you would definitely think that that would matter. Now, how it plays out, it wouldn't be hard to imagine how it could, everything I've talked about here would be even more pronounced in a more interdependent culture. But people are complicated and life is nuanced, and you could imagine how the opposite is true. That is, because I can bank on our interconnection, I'm not going to be set loose the way people in independent cultures are more like free agents. I can trust the acceptance from other people, and that can dial down the anxiety that people experience in conversation. But it's something that could easily be tested.
And here's another question related to sort of rating the good conversationalists. What are the attributes of warmth?
What are the attributes of warmth? We're going to try to break that down a little more. One of the things that we wanted to look at, and we can do it in-person conversations, that when we were all set to look at this, it was during Zoom time, unfortunately, which is you detect warmth in other people when they are leaning in. We approach positive stimuli and we lean away from negative stimuli. So when I lean toward you, that's a signal that I don't find any reason to find you aversive. You pick that up, and that comes across as warmth. And we tried to score our Zoom conversations that way. You can't do it. It just doesn't come across as well. So happily, we're back to in-person conversations. The round robin conversations, which we're doing now in the Big Red Barn, they're so complicated that you're going from one conversation to the next. We can't videotape those the way that we did with our laboratory conversations or the Zoom-based conversations.
I had one related to public speaking, and that's just sort of at the beginning. A lot of what you're saying, people are anxious, nervous, fearful. They really care about what someone is saying. I know many people would put public speaking in that category as well. And is there a correlation of people who feel they're not good conversationalists also are terrified of public speaking?
Yeah, yes, there is, and they are related. And that was that thought, the fact that if you ask people what are the things you're most afraid of, and there are, if you have a phobia, what are you phobic about? public speaking looms really large. And one of the things that led to this research, I had done earlier research on public speaking and how to cure people of their phobia of public speaking. I can say a little more about that. And part of the reason for doing this research was wondering, exactly like the questioner, is conversation, do people feel the same way about informal conversation the way they do about public speaking? And it's not the same depth of the same intensity, but it has a lot of the same flavor. And yeah, it's pervasive how often people think they're not that great at conversation, in much the same way people think they aren't good public speakers. The stakes are higher in public speaking because there's less of an exchange. It's usually one person who feels like the center of attention and is the center of attention with a large audience. And that sort of amps up the anxiety that we see here. But part of the research was to see, are these two things cut from the same cloth? Incidentally, one of the ways that we dealt with, we are able to calm people down about their fear of public speaking, is that the fear is sort of two-headed. People fear that they just aren't going to do it very well. Their message won't be clear. They'll stammer, start to create fractured sentences, etc. There's that fear. There's also the fear they're nervous about public speaking and they're worried that their nervousness will show. And we had done other research supporting what we call the illusion of transparency. We think we are more transparent than we actually are. That is, whatever emotions we're feeling, other people can see them. This, by the way, you probably can relate to this. It leads to marital strife every now and then. You should have known. I gave you clear signals that I wanted to leave that conversation, let's say. Well, you aren't as transparent as you think you are. So if you tell people before they give a public speech that, look, you're probably worried about a couple of things. One of them you don't need to worry about. People can't, if you're nervous, fine, don't worry about that. People don't know. And you present the research findings on the illusion of transparency. You have them give an extemporaneous talk on a politically charged subject. They're better at it. You tape record them and you show them to people who score debates, for example. They're rated as doing better.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions. One relates to, again, about being a good conversationalist. Does one's pitch and volume affect if you're a good conversationalist, and how someone perceives you?
Yeah, we did find in the early Zoom conversations that were really just empirically driven, that the good conversationalist talked louder. And again, that doesn't mean throw as much volume as you can in there. There certainly has to be a limit to that. But if you imagine people going into conversation with a little uncertainty, what do we do when we are uncertain? We pull back a little bit, which is not the right strategy. The good conversationalists presumably are more relaxed. They don't dial it back, and they come across as talking not just faster, but louder as well.
So here's a good one to end on because it relates to how you begin a conversation. Someone's asking if your team came up with any icebreakers, because you mentioned that at the start. Icebreakers.
We didn't. We have, conversation is so complicated, delightfully. And what that means is we've got a giant master list of studies to do. It doesn't include that one, however, partly because there's a lot of stuff out there, some of it empirically based, a lot of it not, of how to engage, how to get people started. If you come to Cornell and you have to go through these onboarding experiences, you're told by the, residential life people, or, so many different groups in Day Hall, how to get things started. So we've sort of felt like, well, we can leave it to those folks. What people haven't addressed is the fear, the very common fear expressed in that quote by Nathan Heller of, okay, I'm in this conversation and I'm worried that I don't have anything left to say and you're bored, but you're being polite. How do I end this thing? Or I can see your eyes are looking over at those people talking, and now I can see, oh, you'd rather be talking to them. How do I get out of here? So what we want to do, what is on our master list, is not icebreakers, but what we're calling ice makers. How do you get out of a conversation that you feel has run its course in a way that you feel comfortable with? That shouldn't be that hard. And if you coach people in how to do that, again, I think it'll go a long way toward calming people down.
And I apologize that the person who asked the question did say ice makers. I misread it as going fast. I think we should assume, even though you couldn't see, all of our eyes were on you. We were very interested. You were a great conversationalist. I'd like to thank you for your time today. And I'm sorry it was more one way than you might have preferred.
I still had a lot lot of fun. This was great. Okay. I couldn't see who I was speaking to,
And unfortunately, that's the way our Zoom lives have been. Thank you to all the attendees today.
Yes, thank you.
I want to mention we have a couple lectures still happening in May for CAPE. May 12th at 10:30 a.m. We have Sarah Ivanega, who will be speaking on COVID, climate, and crops, why the world needs GMOs. And on May 24th, time to be arranged, Charlie Van Loan will be speaking on less than zero, rethinking STEM literacy. So thank you again, attendees, and thank you very much, Tom, for today.
My pleasure.